The sound of the spoons scraping against the bottom of the plate echoed in the Warners' dining room. Nicholas, just 7 years old, watched his mother, Rachel, intently as she seemed increasingly lethargic during mealtimes. His blue eyes, inherited from his mother, roamed the oak table as he tried to understand why she had been different over the last few months. Dr. Marcus Bennett, her stepfather for 2 years, was serving another portion of the stew he had prepared himself. It was a scene that was repeated almost every night at his home in Concord, New Hampshire. The doctor, a respected director of Concord General Hospital, maintained a controlled smile as he watched Rachel bring the spoon to her mouth with slower and slower movements. "Honey, you need to eat better," said Marcus, his soft voice masking a concern that Nicholas sensed was not genuine. "Your medication needs to be taken on a full stomach." Nicholas had noticed the subtle changes in his mother's behavior since Marcus had started to personally take care of his diet. Rachel, once an energetic and passionate literature teacher at Concord High School, was now barely able to keep her eyes open during her lessons. Her students began to comment, and gossip ran through the school corridors. "I'm fine, Marcus," Rachel murmured, her voice slurred. "Just a bit tired." The boy rummaged through his own plate, remembering the conversations he had overheard between Marcus and his fellow doctors at the hospital during his occasional visits with his mother. Words like dosage and addiction floated through his young but precocious mind. The tension in the dining room was palpable, even if Marcus maintained his facade as a devoted husband. Nicholas watched as he got up to fetch more water from the kitchen, his methodical footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. It was at that moment that he saw something that confirmed his suspicions: a small bottle being discreetly emptied into Rachel's glass. Nicholas' heart raced. Mrs. Henderson's citizenship lessons came back to his mind, especially the part about emergency situations and when to call the police. His small hand slid into his jeans pocket, where he kept the cell phone he had gotten for his last birthday for emergencies. "I'm going to the bathroom," Nicholas announced, getting up from the table with a calm that didn't reflect his internal state. In the bathroom on the second floor, with trembling hands, he dialed 911. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional. "911. What is your emergency?" "My name is Nicholas Warner," he whispered, afraid of being overheard. "I live at 247 Pine Street. My stepfather is putting something in my mother's food. She's getting sicker and sicker." The dispatcher, sensing the seriousness in the young man's voice, kept Nicholas on the line while she activated the nearest units. "Are you safe now, Nicholas?" "Yes, I'm in the restroom, but I need to get back to the table before he gets suspicious." "Stay calm, Nicholas. Keep acting normally. Help is on the way." The next few minutes seemed to drag by. Nicholas returned to the table, where Marcus was serving dessert, vanilla pudding, Rachel's favorite. His mother could barely keep her spoon steady, her movements increasingly uncoordinated. Sirens began to sound in the distance, gradually drawing closer. Marcus' face hardened, his mask of tranquility beginning to crack. Rachel, in her semi-conscious state, barely registered the noise. "It must be an accident in the neighborhood," Marcus commented, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Blue and red lights soon illuminated the dining room windows. The sound of cars parking and doors slamming broke the false peace of the Warners' home. Nicholas felt a mixture of fear and relief when he heard the firm knocks on the front door. "Concord Police! Open the door!" Marcus's face lost all color. His gaze met Nicholas, and for the first time, the boy saw the real man behind the mask of the respectable doctor. It was a look of contained fury and disbelief. The following events unfolded as if in slow motion. The cops moved in, Marcus was detained, and paramedics surrounded Rachel, who was immediately taken to hospital. Police investigators searched the house, finding an arsenal of prescription drugs in Marcus' office, along with detailed notes on dosages and effects. Nicholas watched from the living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket that a kind policewoman had given him. Detective Lisa Morrison, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, sat down next to him. "You were very brave, Nicholas," she said softly. "You saved your mother." The tears finally came, not of fear or sadness, but of relief. The nightmare that had settled silently in their home was finally coming to an end. As the police continued their work, Nicholas thought of his mother, now receiving proper treatment in hospital. The night that had begun like so many others ended with a promise of change. The dinner interrupted at the dining room table would be the last that Marcus Bennett would prepare for his family. The courage of a 7-year-old boy had exposed the truth behind the perfect facade of their home, proving that sometimes heroes come in small sizes, armed only with a cell phone and the determination to do the right thing. Concord General Hospital was buzzing the next morning. Dr. Marcus Bennett, one of the institution's most respected doctors, had been arrested the night before, and the corridors were buzzing with rumors and speculation. Detective Lisa Morrison walked determinedly through the toxicology department, her heels echoing on the linoleum floor as she carried a pile of medical records. Rachel Warner was in room 412, receiving detox treatment. Preliminary tests had revealed an alarming mixture of benzodiazepines and opioids in her system, at levels that could have been fatal if the abuse had continued. Nicholas was sitting beside his mother's bed, holding her hand as she slept, still under the influence of medication. This time, properly prescribed to aid her recovery. "How is she?" asked Detective Morrison to Dr. James Chun, the toxicologist in charge of the case. "The toxicity levels are worrying," replied the doctor, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the results. Bennett was administering an extremely dangerous combination. "We found traces of alprazolam, oxycodone, and other sedatives. The most disturbing thing is that the dosages have been gradually increasing over the last 18 months. Nicholas' aunt, Karen Mitchell, arrived at the hospital that morning, rushing from Portland, Maine. She hugged her nephew tightly, her silent tears wetting the boy's hair. "You were so brave, my love," she whispered, stroking his back. While Nicholas received comfort from his aunt, Detective Morrison continued her investigation in Dr. Chen's office. The evidence was beginning to reveal a disturbing pattern that went beyond Rachel's case. "We found inconsistencies in several of Dr. Bennett's patient records," explained Dr. Chen, spreading out documents on his desk. "Some of his patients presented with symptoms similar to Rachel's: chronic fatigue, mental confusion, unexplained chemical dependency." The detective made notes on her pad as she listened. "How many cases are we talking about?" "So far, we've identified 7 suspected cases in the last 5 years. All women, all presenting similar patterns of behavior and symptoms." In Rachel's room, Nicholas watched the heart monitors with the curiosity typical of his age. His Aunt Karen was talking quietly to a social worker, discussing temporary custody arrangements while her sister recovered. "The boy can stay with me in Portland," Karen affirmed. "I have space, and he needs stability now." The social worker, Mrs. Rodriguez, was making notes on her clipboard. "I agree that it would be best for Nicholas at the moment, but he will need to return to testify when the case goes to trial." Nicholas pretended not to hear the adults' conversation, but every word stuck in his memory. His gaze alternated between his mother's pale face and the hospital window, where he could see the trees in the park swaying gently in the spring breeze. At the police station in Concord, the interrogation of Marcus Bennett was underway. The doctor maintained his professional posture, even though he was wearing his orange prison uniform. His lawyer, a man in an expensive suit with a stern expression, was sitting next to him. "Dr. Bennett," began Detective Robert Hayes, Detective Morrison's partner, "can you explain to us why you had such an extensive stock of prescription drugs at your residence?" "As a doctor, I keep free samples for patients in need," replied Marcus, his voice calm and measured. "Everything is perfectly legal and documented." "And the notebooks with notes on specific dosages for your wife?" "Medical research." Rachel agreed to take part in a study on anxiety treatment. The detective slid a photo across the table. Rachel in a semi-conscious state during dinner the night before. "That doesn't sound like an ethical medical study, doctor." Back at the hospital, Detective Morrison was interviewing the head nurse of the ward where Marcus worked. Sandra Peterson, a professional with 30 years' experience, revealed disturbing details about the doctor's behavior. "He always insisted on seeing certain patients personally," Sandra explained, her hands nervously adjusting her badge. "Mostly women in vulnerable situations, divorcees, widows, single mothers." The investigation was beginning to reveal an even more sinister pattern. Marcus Bennett wasn't just an abusive husband. He was a methodical predator who used his position of power to manipulate and control vulnerable women. Nicholas, oblivious to the more sordid details of the investigation, concentrated on his mother. Rachel began to show signs of waking up, her eyes blinking slowly. "Mom," she called softly, squeezing his hand. "Nicholas?" Rachel's voice was hoarse, but clearer than it had been in months. "What happened?" Karen quickly approached the bed, holding her sister's other hand. "You're safe now, Rachel. Nicholas saved you." The confusion on Rachel's face was gradually replaced by understanding and then horror, as the memories of the last few months began to organize themselves in her still foggy mind. Silent tears streamed down her face as she finally understood the extent of the manipulation she had suffered. "My brave son," she whispered, pulling Nicholas into a weak but loving embrace. Detective Morrison watched the scene from the bedroom door, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a long journey of recovery for the Warner family. But thanks to the courage of a 7-year-old boy, not only was his mother being saved, but potentially many other victims would be identified and helped. The investigation was only just beginning, but one thing was certain. The mask of the respectable Dr. Marcus Bennett had fallen, revealing the monster hiding behind the white coat. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. Revelations at the hospital. Dr. James Chun was intently studying the toxicological analyses in his office when Detective Morrison returned with a new file in hand. The white walls of the hospital reflected the cold morning light as more grim details about Dr. Bennett emerged. "We found something disturbing in the old records," said Morrison, spreading documents out on the table. Bennett worked in 3 different hospitals before coming to Concord. In each of them, there were suspicious cases similar to Rachel's. The toxicologist adjusted his glasses, examining the papers. Women with unexplained symptoms of drug addiction? Exactly. And they all had something in common. They were his patients and ended up becoming dependent on prescription drugs. In room 412, Rachel Warner was more lucid, although still weak. Nicholas remained by her side, drawing on a pad of paper that a nurse had kindly provided. Karen was organizing some belongings she had brought from home, trying to make the hospital environment more welcoming. "Mom," Nicholas asked, without taking his eyes off his drawing, "do you remember when you started to feel different?" Rachel closed her eyes, trying to organize memories that seemed submerged in a dense fog. "I think it was after that bad cold, about 18 months ago. Marcus insisted that I needed special vitamins." Karen exchanged a meaningful glance with a social worker, Mrs. Rodriguez, who was discreetly making notes in the corner of the room. The pattern was beginning to become clear. Bennett had taken advantage of a moment of Rachel's physical vulnerability to begin his manipulation. At the police station, Detective Hayes continued his interrogation. "Dr. Bennett, can you explain why you left St. Mary's Hospital in Buffalo so abruptly in 2019? Marcus kept his posture controlled, but a slight tremor in his right hand betrayed his anxiety. "I got a better offer in Concord. It's common for doctors to change hospitals in search of better opportunities. And it had nothing to do with the internal investigation into patient Amanda Collins." The name made Marcus visibly stiffen. His lawyer quickly intervened. "My client won't comment on previous cases without proper legal documentation." Back at the hospital, Detective Morrison was interviewing a former nurse from St. Mary's, who had transferred to Concord at the same time as Bennett. Martha Sullivan had harbored her suspicions for years, tormented by fear and guilt. "I should have said something earlier," Martha confessed, her hands shaking as she clutched a cup of coffee. Amanda Collins was a young widow, only 32 years old. Bennett started treating her for anxiety after her husband's death. Within a few months, she could barely function without medication. Nicholas, watching the hospital from the window of his mother's room, noticed the intense movement of police and investigators. His young brain processed everything with an acumen beyond his years. He realized how his 911 call had triggered something much bigger than he had imagined. "Aunt Karen," he called softly, "have other people also been hurt by Dr. Marcus?" Karen hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, dear. But thanks to you, they'll get help now too." In the hospital laboratory, Dr. Chun was making an alarming discovery. "Detective, I found a pattern in the other victims' blood samples. Bennett wasn't just drugging these women. He was creating a specific cocktail of drugs that cause progressive addiction. Morrison examined the results. Did he develop his own formula? Yes, and it's brilliant in a perverse way. The doses were calculated to create dependency without causing an immediate overdose. He kept his victims functional enough not to arouse suspicion, but completely dependent on him. Rachel, listening to part of the conversation through the ajar door, felt a shiver run down her spine. He planned the whole thing, she whispered. From the beginning, the investigation was expanding rapidly. Teams were sent to the previous hospitals where Bennett had worked. Former patients were located and interviewed. A sinister pattern of manipulation and abuse of power emerged with each new discovery. Later that afternoon, Detective Morrison gathered her team for an update on the case. We have evidence of at least 12 victims in 4 different states. Bennett used his medical reputation to select vulnerable women, usually after significant loss or trauma. He began with seemingly legitimate prescriptions and gradually increased his chemical dependency. Nicholas fell asleep on the sofa in the hospital room, exhausted after an intense few days. Rachel watched him with a mixture of pride and sadness, realizing how her 7-year-old son had been forced to grow up so quickly. "He saved more than just you," Karen commented softly, covering her nephew with a blanket. "He exposed a predator that had been at work for years." Rachel nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. "How could I not have noticed before? I was a teacher, supposedly intelligent and observant." Bennett was an expert in manipulation, Mrs. Rodriguez intervened gently. "He chose his victims carefully and used his medical knowledge to maintain control. It's not your fault." As night fell over Concord, the pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place. The story of abuse and manipulation that had begun to unfold with a simple emergency call from a brave boy was turning into one of the most complex cases the New Hampshire police had ever investigated. Dr. Marcus Bennett, the respected physician who had built his career on a facade of care and compassion, was about to face the consequences of years of manipulation and abuse. And all thanks to the keen insight and courage of a 7-year-old child who refused to remain silent in the face of her mother's suffering. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. A week after Dr. Bennett's arrest, the town of Concord was buzzing with new revelations. Detective Morrison was in her office at the police station, analyzing a growing pile of statements when a call from the FBI changed the course of the investigation. "We have a similar case in Providence, Rhode Island," reported Special Agent Diana Walsh. "A doctor named Caroline Winters noticed the pattern in 2017, but was silenced. She tried to alert the medical board about Bennett." "Silenced how?" Morrison straightened in his chair, his interest piqued. "She had a suspicious car accident just after giving evidence. She survived, but was in a coma for 3 months. When she woke up, all the evidence was gone." At the hospital, Rachel Warner was having her first therapy session with Dr. Samantha Hayes, a specialist in trauma and drug addiction. Nicholas was in the cafeteria with Karen, drawing on his pad while his aunt chatted with Martha Sullivan, the former nurse at St. Mary's. Bennett had powerful connections, Martha explained quietly. When Amanda Collins started asking questions in Buffalo, he mobilized the entire hospital administration against her. No one would believe an unstable mental patient against a respected doctor. Karen felt a chill. "And what happened to Amanda?" Martha looked away. "Suicide? Or at least that's what the official report said." In Dr. Hayes' office, Rachel was beginning to process the extent of the abuse she had suffered. "He controlled everything." Her voice shook. "My medication, my food, my friendships, even my bank account. It's a classic pattern of coercive abuse," the therapist explained. "But you have something that many victims don't have, an extraordinarily perceptive and courageous son." In the police evidence room, Detective Hayes and Detective Morrison were assembling a complex picture of Bennett's activities. Photos, medical reports, and timelines covered the walls. One particularly disturbing discovery caught their eye: suspicious bank transactions linking Bennett to a private clinic in Vermont. He wasn't alone, Hayes concluded. Someone was helping him cover up the cases, someone with access to medical records and administrative influence. FBI agent Walsh arrived in Concord that afternoon, bringing with her the Caroline Winters case files. We need to talk to your son, Rachel, she explained gently. Nicholas may have observed details that will help us identify Bennett's accomplices. The interview was conducted in the hospital's playroom, an environment designed to make children feel safe. Nicholas sat on a colorful poof, cuddled up to his favorite stuffed dinosaur that Karen had brought from home. Do you remember seeing people visiting your house at night, Nicholas? Asked Walsh, keeping a casual tone as she drew with him. Yes, replied the boy, concentrating on his drawing of a hospital. A man would come sometimes late at night. He and Dr. Marcus would talk in the office. He always wore a gold snake brooch. Walsh and Morrison exchanged meaningful glances. The brooch was the symbol of the New England Medical Association, an exclusive association of influential doctors. Meanwhile, at the state prison, Marcus Bennett was being visited by his lawyer, Richard Sterling. They're getting close to the clinic in Vermont, Sterling whispered. Dr. Harrison is nervous. Bennett kept his composure, but his eyes betrayed his concern. Remind him that we all have a lot to lose if he talks. The investigation was given a new impetus when Caroline Winters, now recovered and living in Canada, agreed to testify. Via video conference, she identified the man with the gold brooch, Dr. Victor Harrison, director of the clinic in Vermont and a member of the board who had dismissed her complaints years earlier. It was an elaborate scheme, Caroline explained to Morrison and Walsh. Bennett would identify vulnerable patients, manipulate them into addiction, and then refer them to Harrison's clinic for treatment. There, they were kept doped up while their bank accounts were drained by exorbitant treatment fees. Nicholas remained a key player in the investigation. His photographic memory and keen observation provided details that the adults had overlooked. During a new drawing session, he mentioned something crucial. Dr. Marcus always kept important papers behind the board in his office, he commented casually, coloring in his drawing. The board had a secret button. A thorough search of Bennett's office revealed a hidden compartment containing compromising documents, patient lists, drug formulas, payment records, and, most importantly, emails exchanged between Bennett, Harrison, and other doctors involved in the scam. Rachel, watching Nicholas play with other children in the hospital playground, felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Her son had not only saved her, but was helping to dismantle a network of abuse that stretched across several states. He was always very observant, she commented to Karen. He noticed things that I, in my altered state, couldn't see. Children often see the truth more clearly than adults, Karen replied. They haven't been conditioned to ignore their instincts. Night fell over Concord, but the lights in the police station remained on. Detective Morrison and Agent Walsh were preparing search warrants for the clinic in Vermont. The circle was closing around not just Bennett, but a whole network of corrupt doctors who had turned the Hippocratic Oath into a tool of exploitation. Nicholas fell asleep in the hospital room, holding his mother's hand. Rachel, more lucid by the day, watched her son sleep, silently promising herself that she would never again allow anyone to manipulate her perception of reality. The truth, as her brave son had shown, was the most powerful of medications. Chapter 5. The web unravels. The FBI raided the Green Mountain Clinic in Burlington, Vermont, in the early hours of the morning. Agent Walsh led the operation, coordinating tactical teams while Detective Morrison and Detective Hayes waited outside. Dr. Victor Harrison was about to discover that his medical manipulation empire was crumbling. Federal police. Search warrant. The agents entered the sterile corridors of the clinic, finding a disturbing scene. In the private rooms, patients in various states of sedation occupied luxurious beds, connected to sophisticated monitoring equipment. My God, whispered Morrison, examining a clipboard. Some of these women have been here for over a year. In Concord, Rachel Warner was having a difficult conversation with Nicholas in his hospital room. The detox was progressing well, but the doctors had discovered liver damage that would require continuous monitoring. Honey, Rachel held her son's hand. We need to talk about something important. The police have found other people that Dr. Marcus heard, and they need you to tell them what you saw in a place called Court. Nicholas played with his stuffed dinosaur, processing the information. Like when Mrs. Henderson taught us about witnesses in citizenship class? Just like that, Karen interjected softly, sitting on the other side of the bed. You'll be very brave, as you have been before. At the clinic in Vermont, the FBI team discovered an underground file room. In protected computers, they found detailed records of each victim, manipulated medical histories, fraudulent financial transactions, and, most disturbingly, videos of therapy sessions where doctors deliberately increased the doses of drugs to create dependency. Harrison got away, an agent informed Walsh. But he left a trail. Flight reservations to Cancun in his wife's name. He won't get far, Walsh replied, already calling the Mexican authorities. We have agents at Burlington Airport and alerts at all the borders. Back at the hospital in Concord, Dr. Chun presented new results to the medical team treating Rachel. The combination of drugs used by Bennett was even more sophisticated than we imagined. He developed a protocol that created psychological and physical dependence simultaneously. Nicholas, who had developed a habit of drawing everything he considered important, created a new drawing, a detailed map of Marcus' office, including where each bottle of medicine was kept. Detective Morrison was impressed by the accuracy of the boy's observations. "You have an incredible memory, Nicholas," she commented, studying the drawing. "This will help us a lot to understand how he organized his scheme." At the state prison, Marcus Bennett received the news of the operation in Vermont from his lawyer. His mask of calm finally cracked. "Harrison's going to talk," he muttered, wiping his hands across his face. "He's always been the weak link." The investigation revealed that the network of corrupt doctors stretched across 6 states, involving dozens of health professionals. Caroline Winters, now actively collaborating with the FBI, identified patterns of behavior that helped locate other victims. They chose women who were already emotionally fragile, she explained during a video conference with the investigative team. Divorced women, widows, single mothers, people who desperately needed to believe that a respected doctor was really trying to help them. Rachel, listening to Caroline's testimony from her hospital room, recognized her own story in the doctor's words. "I was so vulnerable after the divorce," she confessed to her therapist. "Marcus seemed so attentive, so concerned about my well-being." Nicholas remained a key player in the investigation. During a session with forensic psychologist Dr. Patricia Lambert, he revealed more details about the nightly meetings in the office. "They talked about numbers," he said, drawing a series of symbols he remembered seeing on Marcus papers. "And there was a list of names with different stars next to them." Later analysis revealed that the stars indicated different levels of progress in the drug addiction scheme. Red for beginners, gold for completely dependent, black for cases that needed to be dropped. Victor Harrison was captured at Cancun Airport, carrying a suitcase with $500,000 in cash and a collection of false passports. His arrest triggered a series of confessions among lower-ranking members of the organization. "It's surreal," Hayes commented to Morrison as they reviewed the evidence. This whole elaborate scheme being dismantled because a 7-year-old boy noticed something wrong at dinner. Rachel began attending a support group for survivors of medical abuse, finding strength in connecting with other victims. Nicholas often accompanied her, sitting quietly in a corner with his drawing pad, documenting his mother's recovery journey through his childlike eyes. "Sometimes it's the children who save us," said one of the group's participants, watching Nicholas. "They haven't yet learned to doubt their instincts, to ignore the red flags that we adults rationalize." The state prosecutor's office, working together with the FBI, was preparing a solid case against Bennett, Harrison, and their accomplices. The evidence was overwhelming. Falsified medical records, victim testimonies, suspicious financial transactions, and, crucially for the jury, the precise drawings and observations of a child who refused to remain silent in the face of evil. The web of lies and manipulation, built up over years by doctors who had betrayed their sacred oath, was finally unraveling. And it all started with a 911 call made by a little boy who knew something was wrong on his mother's plate. Chapter 6. The testimony of innocence. The New Hampshire District Court was packed on the morning of the trial. Nicholas Warner, now 8 years old, adjusted his blue bow tie while holding tightly to his mother's hand. 3 months had passed since Dr. Bennett's arrest, and the Warner family's life was gradually returning to normal. "Are you ready, darling?" Rachel asked softly, her eyes, now clear and alert, meeting those of her son. Detox had been a difficult process, but she was finally free of the drugs that had clouded her mind for so long. "Yes, Mom," Mrs. Henderson said that telling the truth is always right, even when it's hard. Detective Morrison met them in the court corridor. "Nicholas, remember, you only have to tell what you saw. There are no right or wrong answers." The jury was already in place when Nicholas was called to testify. The prosecutor, Jessica Lang, had carefully prepared the boy for this moment, working with child psychologists to ensure that the process was as less traumatic as possible. "Nicholas," Lang began gently, "can you tell us about the night you called 911? With surprising clarity for his age, Nicholas described the dinner scene, the bottle being emptied into his mother's glass, the whispered conversations in the office late at night. His childish voice echoed through the courtroom, carrying a weight that made several jurors discreetly wipe away tears. Marcus Bennett, sitting at the defense table in his expensive suit, kept his expression neutral, but his fingers drummed nervously on the table. His empire of manipulation was crumbling under the testimony of a child. "And can you show us your drawings, Nicholas?" asked Lang, presenting the evidence pad. The boy's meticulous drawings were projected onto a large screen. The office with its secret drawers, the color-coded medicine bottles, even a diagram of the nightly meetings with the other doctors. Every detail had been captured by the observant eyes of a child who, without knowing it, was documenting one of the biggest cases of medical misconduct in New Hampshire history. On the other side of the country, in Seattle, Dr. Caroline Winters was watching the trial via video conference. Her persistence in exposing the truth, even after the accident that almost cost her life, had paved the way for this moment. "This boy's testimony," she commented to Agent Walsh, who was coordinating the broadcast, "did in 3 months what I've been trying to do for years." Sometimes we need the innocence of a child to expose the darkest truths. In court, the defense lawyer, Richard Sterling, stood up for cross-examination. His challenge was clear: how to question a child's credibility without looking like a villain in front of the jury. "Nicholas," he began, his voice studiedly soft, "you have a very active imagination, don't you? Do you like to create stories?" "Objection, Your Honor." Lang stood up. "The witness is a child." "Overruled, but watch the line of questioning, Mr. Sterling." Nicholas looked directly at the lawyer. "I don't create stories, sir. I draw what I see. Like when Dr. Marcus put the white powder in Mama's glass and wrote it down in the black notebook with the golden snake on the cover." The detail of the notebook made Bennett visibly pale. That particular notebook, which contained detailed records of his experiments, had been found in his house in Vermont, hidden in a safe. Rachel, watching from the gallery, felt a mixture of pride and pain. Her son had been forced to grow up so quickly, to take on a protective role, when he should have just been playing and being a child. Dr. Samantha Hayes, who had treated Rachel during her recovery, was the next witness. She presented scientific evidence of the damage caused by the drug cocktail developed by Bennett. The protocol created by the defendant, she explained, was deliberately designed to create dependency while keeping the victims functional enough not to arouse suspicion. It was ingenious and completely unethical. During the lunch break, Nicholas sat with his Aunt Karen in the court cafeteria, drawing as usual. This time, his drawing showed his mother smiling, teaching again at Concord High School, a future that now seemed possible. "Do you know," Karen said, watching her nephew, "that you not only saved your mother, but helped save a lot of other people too?" Nicholas nodded, concentrating on his drawing. "Mrs. Henderson says that doing the right thing is sometimes like throwing a pebble into a pond. The waves keep spreading even after the stone sinks." In the afternoon, Dr. James Chillen presented the final toxicological analyses, demonstrating how Bennett's scheme had evolved over the years, becoming more sophisticated and more lethal. Each new victim was an experiment to refine his formula, Chillen explained. If it wasn't stopped, the damage could have expanded exponentially. When the jury retired to deliberate, Detective Morrison found Nicholas and Rachel in the hallway. "Regardless of the outcome," she said, "you two have changed a lot of lives. Sometimes the most important heroes are those who simply refuse to be silent." The verdict came after 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Marcus Bennett would face decades in prison, as would his accomplices. The network of corrupt doctors had been completely dismantled. Weeks later, Rachel returned to the classroom, stronger and wiser. Nicholas continued to draw, but now his drawings showed happier scenes. His mother teaching, the support group meetings where survivors shared stories of recovery, the new puppy Karen had given him as a present. "Do you know what I like most about drawing now?" he asked his mother one evening, while she was correcting work on her desk. "What, my love?" "Real smiles. Before, when you smiled, your eyes were always sad. Now they really shine." Rachel hugged her son, her little hero who had had the courage to see the truth through the eyes of innocence and the strength to act when adults failed. The Bennett Warner case, as it became known, changed medical protocols across the country, introducing new systems of verification and control. And it all started with a 911 call made by a boy who knew something was wrong at his family's dinner.